and welcome to the Festival of the Mind. Today we're going to present to you our project, Brain Orchard. Now, the Brain Orchard is a series of artistic depictions based on dementia research that is conducted here at the University of Sheffield in collaboration with artist Kate Sully. So the paintings are basically about research done on Alzheimer's disease, and as you may know, this is a progressive neurodegenerative condition that affects around 850,000 people across the UK today, and this number continues to rise. The current problem in research is that there are no definitive diagnostic criteria that are available to diagnose this disease in its earlier stages, which is asymptomatic or when patients don't present with any symptoms. And this is the crucial stage, as the treatments that we have available are most effective in this stage. And we don't really have any effective treatments available, which is why we wanted to collaborate with Kate and through artistic expression try to communicate the message about increasing the awareness about Alzheimer's disease and trying to tackle it early. So let me introduce you to the team. We've got Kate Sully. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Kate Sully. I'm a visual artist based in Sheffield. I've worked quite a lot with the University of Sheffield in collaborations before with different researchers, and I've created 5 large pieces of work for this project for Festival of the Mind.
Thank you, Kate. Now let me introduce you to the academic team. We're all from the Department of Neuroscience, University of Sheffield. We also call it the Sheffield Institute for Translational Neuroscience, which is there. We aim to translating neuroscience research from bench to the bedside, so that so that we can develop treatments that will help patients who suffer from neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's disease or motor neuron disease. So I am Anmohi Dake. I'm a third-year PhD student, and my work is basically on Alzheimer's disease, and I look at different cardiovascular risk factors such as type 2 diabetes and obesity. These are conditions that affect the heart, and I look at how these conditions can affect the brain in Alzheimer's disease and normal aging by studying MRI images. Next we have Dr. Simon Bell. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, so I'm Simon. I'm a neurology registrar and also a final year PhD student working at SITraN with Mo and Dan. And my work focuses around astrocytes, which are a particular type of brain cell, which I'll tell you a little bit more about a bit later on.
Thanks, Simon. Dan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Dan Blackburn. I'm a consultant neurologist and an academic. My main interest is about creating new tools that can diagnose Alzheimer's at the earliest stage. As Mo was saying, we need better tools to diagnose people at this stage. And although there are some expensive technologies such as PET scans, which we're now getting in Sheffield, that can be useful, I'm more interested in sort of low-cost, scalable techniques. One of which involves EEG, an old technique which we may talk about later on, and another one about analysing how people describe their memory complaints.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Simon. Thanks, Kate. We also have Professor Dame Pamela Shaw, who was the lead researcher on this project and is also the director of SITraN. Right, so I'd like to ask you, Kate, before I carry on, so what made you want to kind of approach the Department of Neuroscience, and what made you want to do this project?
So I've always been quite interested in science, as I mentioned before, but I've particularly recently been interested in the brain and brain patterns and the sort of role of creativity within the brain and whether that can sort of, I suppose, get a general sense of well-being. So the entrepreneur in residence, Kerry Batchelor, introduced me to Professor Dame Pamela Shaw early this year, and then she obviously then introduced me to these guys, and I was sort of interested then to find out in the wider context, obviously with the Alzheimer's disease, how that might affect my interest in the brain, I suppose, and just find out more about brain pattern and brain function, and just sort of I became more and more inspired. So that's sort of how I got started really for this.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm really glad that you did get in touch. This has been a very enjoyable process for all of us as well, I can say. Do you guys agree?
Very much so, yeah. It's really good. It's interesting to see how the artistic development and how our sort of research ideas translate into art that hopefully then people can engage with as well.
So, Kate, you created 5 really big paintings. Do you want to talk us through why you chose to make 5 paintings and why they were the scale that they are?
So, the reason I made 5 is obviously as an artist I do quite like to work in collections rather than just making one piece. Obviously there's 3 areas of research to look at, so that was like 3 paintings. And then for me to put it into the context so that when the public could see the artwork, I thought it was important to see one of the paintings, Equilibrium, is more about, I suppose, my interpretation of a healthy brain. And how brain patterns might work sort of in an ordinary person without Alzheimer's disease. And then the last painting, Mortality, I suppose is me looking at how the brain is aging, and so that if you look at the 5 paintings in context, which we'll look at a little bit later, I think you can see the sort of relationship between them all. So it felt like having that collection was quite important, so that each one, not the same as each other, but there are patterns and there are links, so that when you see them all together, you can sort of follow the story, which is what we're trying to sort of give a story out to the public, examining different research and different sort of ways of being inspired by, I suppose, the research. So yeah, that's why I did 5. In terms of the scale, they are quite big. They're 2 meters, each one's 2 meters high, and they range between 1.4 and 1.6 meters wide. And for me, it was important that when the public sees the painting, that you feel quite, not overwhelmed, but it's very large, so that it sort of makes you feel a little bit, I don't know, that the painting is sort of taking over a little bit, and you can explore the patterns, because obviously normally with research everything is tiny, everything's microscopic. So I just thought it'd be to scale something up and let the public see some of the MRI scans and the patterns will be quite an interesting thing, but also just the importance of this research as well. I thought by the size of the paintings gives it, they're big and they're sort of engaging hopefully, and so that it sort of hopefully gets the public to go, this is an important area that we need to sort of look at.
Yeah, I think that definitely comes through.
Good.
Paintings are taller than me, way taller than me.
Yes, they are taller than you, yes.
So I'll explain to you briefly the outline of the current presentation. We'll talk about the different paintings that Kate has created one by one. And we'll just have a brief discussion, a question and answer kind of thing. So the first painting is called Equilibrium. And I'd again like to pass the mic to Kate and ask her, so what made you think of this painting, and what's equilibrium?
So this is the sort of, in my sort of mind, the first painting in the collection. So you can sort of see a little bit the shape of the sort of MRI of the brain, and the way I make the paintings are I have the images, so the science images are printed digitally, quite large scale, and then I assemble or collage them onto a much larger canvas, and then I apply paint and start to sort of draw them and add different colours and different shapes. So I suppose for me this is about thinking about, again, as a non-scientist, the way that brain patterns are passing through and working really well, so that there's a real sort of rhythm to this painting. Everything seemingly got a structure to it, and that the different shapes start at the top and they might even almost come back out of the bottom. So there's a really nice rhythm. So as the inspiration for that was just thinking about a normal brain working really well. Loads of colours, lots of things happening. The idea is quite, I suppose it's quite creative in a way. For me, there's lots of creative ideas going on, as well as sort of the neurons and the different cells in the brain all sort of doing their jobs. So yeah, that's why I wanted to call it Equilibrium. I think it was important when you see the other paintings This one is definitely more structured and definitely more, has a pattern to it.
I think it's really nice from a scientific perspective. I think it's really nice how this painting sets up sort of the complexity that we're faced with when sort of studying the brain. It is this hugely complex organ, possibly the most complex structure in the universe that we know of so far. And I think when you're looking at the painting, there's so many different elements to it. I think that really conveys why we may struggle sometimes to, have developed treatments already, even though we've spent a long time studying Alzheimer's disease. But I also think it's there's clearly defined elements to it as well, which really help to understand how the brain is sectioned into sort of clearly defined elements. So I think it really does, depicts like what the sort of starting point for science as well that we have.
Great stuff.
I think it's quite interesting that you call this painting Equilibrium as well, and I think you mentioned one time that it's kind of like the base image that you look at, and then look at the different kind of research images that you've created. And what I'd like to highlight here is like, we do start off with an equilibrium, but when your brain starts aging, this equilibrium kind of starts getting disturbed, and more so in Alzheimer's disease, and that's why you kind of see this degradation of neurons. Like, it does happen naturally with age, but it is a lot more accelerated in neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's disease. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I agree. And again, with Simon talking about the complexity of the brain, that previously people would come in and the best test we'd have would be doing scans of the brain to look at whether it's the smaller bits of the brain. We know that the temporal lobes sort of underneath the ears shrink more quickly than other areas, and that was a good marker of Alzheimer's dementia, but that's relatively late. So you wouldn't see that if someone came in very early stages. And I think this picture of the equilibrium highlights some of the research that's going on nowadays, that before we can see changes of shrinkage of the brain, can we measure what the brain's doing? Can we measure how connected it is, how synchronized it is between the right and the left hemisphere, the front and the back, and these different networks? And I think this piece of art highlights the complexity, and how can we produce a tool that could measure some of that complexity? How could it measure some of the equilibrium, the synchronization, the connectivity?
Yeah, definitely. Like the complexity really comes through this image.
Yeah, this one I think is probably got the most going on, hasn't it? Even though it has a structure to it, it is quite complicated.
Okay. Should we move on to the next page?
Yeah.
Do you guys have anything more to add?
No, that's fine.
Okay, brilliant. So next we've got Corpus, and this painting is based on. Should I let you? Why don't you tell everyone what it's about?
So obviously this is my interpretation of Mo's research, which is for me looking at, I suppose, it's inspired by her research into a healthy mind and a healthy body, and this was sort of the way of how I sort of approached it. Is it looks like the part of the bottom part of the painting has this sense of looking at, it looks a little bit like intestines, or sort of I don't know, larger than life sort of vessels, and the top bit where the brain is has started to sort of tilt and fall and distort. And for me, this is like an imbalance between the mind and the brain and the body. And so that's how I interpreted Mo's research. And the colours in this, obviously there's quite a lot of pink, and this idea about sweets and candy, and the idea that if we maybe look after ourselves a bit more, maybe, if we look after our brain, our body and our brain will work together. And there's sort of areas of this where I've simplified the brain quite a bit, and there's the way I paint, obviously I've added in layers of paint and sort of built up areas that make it look like there's like I suppose maybe some fat around the brain or the body. So it's just, it's all quite abstract, but that was what I was thinking when I was painting it.
It's actually quite interesting what you say about the intestines, because that little sac, it actually does look like a fat cell in the body.
Yeah, which obviously I wasn't totally aware of at the time. I shouldn't say that, should I? But I think it's weirdly enough when I'm getting to the zone of painting, I think I was talking to you guys about it before, is sometimes I look at the painting once it's finished and I see more in it, and it's almost like it's coming through organically, some of the information that you guys have shared with me, or it sort of like filters down. So that's quite interesting, looking back at a painting once it's finished, because you do get into the painting mode, and at the end of the day these are supposed to be contemporary paintings of a quality, so that they are inspired by the research, of course, but I wanted them to have integrity in both the art world and the science world. So yeah.
I really like that you've used these kind of colours to represent sweets and candy, because one of the main messages from the research that I do in my PhD is that we have to start early. The help that needs to be gotten has to be at the earliest stage possible, because the Alzheimer's disease has this long kind of asymptomatic period where you don't show any symptoms. So you don't know that you're going to progress to it. But what we can do is make tiny changes in our lives. So if you think about like a houseplant, you water it too much, it dies. You don't water it as much, it dies. Doesn't have the right kind of soil, right kind of nutrients. So if you think about your body in a similar way, you have too much food, there's too much fat, that's bad for the brain. If there's too little fat, that is also actually bad for the brain. And you have to also make sure that you eat the right kinds of food. And this is a continuous process and iterative process, and you need to do this throughout life. So earlier the better, that's the message. I just wanted to highlight some of the things that happen in conditions like obesity and diabetes. So the premise of my research is that the the heart supplies blood to the brain, and the brain is supplied by arteries from the heart. So any condition that affects the heart would affect the brain. So as you age, you do see these kind of effects within your arteries. So your arteries actually change in structure. You see formations of deposits within the arteries, or thickening of the walls of the arteries, all of which can be harmful to the blood supply to the brain. And in conditions such as obesity and diabetes, these changes are even more aggravated, and there are more accumulations of these deposits, and there's more thickening of these walls. And therefore, if you think about Alzheimer's disease, so if these conditions are present in Alzheimer's disease with the added effect of aging, it's quite harmful to the brain. And basically, this is the premise. So the more your vascular system or your heart system is affected, the higher the chances are that you'll increase your risk for Alzheimer's disease, which again brings me back to the message about primary prevention and starting early. And it's basically small changes that you can make in your life: eating healthy, exercising regularly. Even social contact is one of the big kind of risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. People who don't see people regularly are at a higher risk. I know COVID-19 makes it a little bit more difficult, but these are just tiny changes that you can make to reduce your risk and everyone else's. And that's it for me. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about Corpus?
No, I think we've covered that. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. So we've got the next painting, and it's called Balance. And I'll hand it over to you again, Kate.
So this painting is inspired by Simon's research into the role of the astrocyte. So this painting is, I suppose it has a little similarities to Equilibrium in a sense. It's quite a lot going on. But for me, this painting is about the role of the astrocyte, as far as, and Simon can correct me later, is a support to the neurons in the brain. So what I wanted to show in this painting is it's quite dynamic. I've collaged in actual images of the astrocytes, scientific images, as well as obviously there's the MRI of the brain. Then I've left in quite a lot of almost like cellular looking images in the painting. So there's like a mixture of paint and I suppose I've let some of the digital images shine through. And I suppose I'm trying to get at this idea that everything is whizzing around, and it's quite, the astrocytes are helping the neurons, and the brain's working really well, and it's sort of quite colourful and quite sort of busy, a lot going on, lots of new things happening. So yeah, that was my interpretation of that. Would you agree, Simon?
No, I think that's good. I think that sort of really nicely highlights the relationship that the cells of the brain have together. I don't know if Mo wants to just move things on. So this is actually an image I've taken of the cells I create. So to get these astrocyte cells or or star cells is the other way to think of them. Is we take skin samples from people with Alzheimer's disease and we reprogram the skin cells into different types of brain cells, and this is what we sort of end up with. And as Kate said, she's used some of these images in the actual creating of the artwork. And the way I sometimes think of the relationship that astrocytes and neurons have is, this is a picture of my daughter, and the relationship that astrocytes and neurons have together is sometimes very similar to the relationship a parent and a child have. You're both quite individual beings, but you have sort of this codependent relationship, especially when your children are younger. And if you just move on to the... but the problem is, like, this is a picture of when she was younger. The relationship between the astrocytes and the neurons can be affected by changes in the astrocyte or the parent, or changes in the neuron. So what my research looks at is how well the astrocyte cells work and how that supports how well the neurons work. And I show this picture here because this is meant to show the example of, as I'm sure most parents have felt, when you're very tired but your children still want to be bouncing around everywhere. And if you imagine that sort of relationship in your brain, that your astrocyte cells aren't working very well but the neurons are, that it will affect how the disease come about, and that might be an important process in something like Alzheimer's disease. And what I actually study is this structure in the cell called the mitochondria, which you can think of as like sort of a battery for the cell. Like I say, if the batteries of the astrocyte don't work very well, then that's going to affect the relationship between the two cells. And that's why I like how Kate's called this balance, because I think there's a fine balance between all the different cells of the brain and how they work together. And it is as that balance sort of shifts in one way, that's essentially how we get disease situations forming. And this idea of lots of the things moving around, one of the things that the astrocytes do is they control the connections between different brain cells. So they actually control the way that the electrical activity moves across the brain. So I really like this bright colour depiction of it. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, did you want to say anything more about balance?
I don't think I was going to say was, I was thinking about when Simon said that, obviously the title of balance is the colours as well, and again, looking at it now, there is a lot of colours going on, but there is also quite a balance between the blue and the yellow, I think, particularly. When I look at it now, it's quite from a visual perspective. So it's interesting how you, again, subconsciously, these things come into play while you... Because obviously, as I'm painting them, I often change the colours. They take quite a long time to do, so I don't just sort of paint it straight and then it's finished. I might paint it blue and then go, do I like the blue? Change the colour. You know, there's a huge painterly process in getting it to work as a piece, as well as tell the story of the research. But yeah, just thinking now, the blue and yellow is quite a balanced sort of palette there.
That way,
I'm quite impressed with that.
Yeah, that way you describe it as well makes me think of like the structure of a brain, because it's not sort of one cell's next to the other. They have this sort of interconnected, weaved sort of approach, and it's you know, the way that I think the way you are sort of creating the images is very similar to the way that the brain.
Yes, I suppose. Yeah, the way they're collaged together, and I mean, I think this painting's made up of 7 pieces of canvas, basically, plus all the collage pieces on top, so it's quite complicated. You can't really see on the slide, but if you see it in the Millennium Gallery, you can probably see there. Do go along and have a look. But I think it's quite complex to achieve, you know, where I wanted it to go to, I suppose.
I remember you talking about this technique where you printed out some images and then put them in the background.
Yeah, so the MRI image that's sort of that, you know, of a brain, you can almost see it in the centre of the painting. So that's a digital print of the science image, and then on top of that, I would then collage that onto a much bigger piece of canvas and then paint on top of that. But obviously, with the astrocytes, you know, that they're also digital images that I've then collaged on and then painted over and added to and all of that. So it's quite a layering of things to achieve that sort of... I mean, they are quite complicated, I suppose. But then you've got it... There's a balance, again, between the too complicated and you know, as a painting, and also to try, as I say, tell the tale of Simon's research. So yeah, cool.
Yeah, again, brings it back to the complexity of everything, doesn't it?
Complex, yes, exactly.
I think the next one's inspired by Dan's research.
Yes. Do you want
Do you want to
Tell us your
describe
thoughts.
this?
Yes,
Kate?
okay, Dan. Yeah, so this one, it's called Consciousness, and again, Dan will talk about his research in more detail than I will. But I suppose the essence of what I think Dan came across for me when I was talking to him about his work was this one. Obviously, almost looks like the brain is suspended in another sort of universe or another consciousness. So there's the top part of it. You've still got the patterns and the sort of things happening, and there's like almost a bit of a rainbow look to it. In my head, there's like little butterfly wings and little patterns still working. But the bottom part of this painting is almost like the brain is suspended. It's almost like hanging in another universe, another consciousness. I suppose when I was speaking to Dan about his research, it sounded as if sometimes with Alzheimer's disease, patients can experience almost like their brains work in a slightly different way, or they're maybe a bit simpler, or they're not connecting in the same way. So it's almost like suspended slightly, whereas some parts are still working. So I was trying to get that, I suppose, like two things going on, where part of the brain looks like it's almost hanging around or slightly, you know, changing, but the top is still looking like things are growing out of it and ideas and connections are still happening. And then also in Dan's research, he talked about, the EEG talked about, is where patients, to do with eyes open and eyes closed, which obviously Dan will talk about. And I suppose in a way, a little bit, the colours in this, the blue and the idea that when you close your eyes and open them, sometimes you feel like it's like quite a dark colours, and so there's a little bit of that going on. So I haven't painted into this one as much as some of the others, so you can still see there's like areas where it's like a digital print, where it's still sort of quite subtle. So it was important that I kept like this sense of a different consciousness. So over to you, Dan. You can talk a bit more about that.
So we all work in large groups, me, Simon, Mo, with lots of other researchers, and Professor Veneri is one of our leads of the Translational Neuropsychology group, and she's created some of these images, the MRI images, and you can see the row on your left-hand side mirror some of the images of the paintwork that Kate has produced. You can see that central bit of the brain. This is work that Professor Veneri has done, as other groups have done, that have measured a bit about how the brain is humming along, working normally. So functional MRI can measure not just what the structure looks like, so the size of the brain, the different bits, the grey matter and the white matter, but you can also get people to sit in the MRI scanner and get them to sit there and think of nothing. And when you think of nothing, you may be imagining what you're going to do later that evening, probably staying in now, it's COVID, or remembering what you did when you were younger, these sort of reminiscence. But the brain has this sort of networks, and you can see in the top row A, that's sort of like the healthy controls, and there's this hub called the default mode network. So the back of the brain, this is called the parietal lobes, connecting to the front of the brain, and they sort of work along in unison together in that state. If you give that in the bottom column C, that's people with Alzheimer's disease, and you get loss of that connectivity. There's a breakdown of that default mode network. And the column in the B is people in the mild cognitive impairment, people who have memory impairment, but it's insufficient to affect their daily living, so they don't meet criteria for Alzheimer's dementia. But about 50% of those people will progress to Alzheimer's disease in 5 years. And so my research, which I did with people in the engineering and the neurophysiology department, was to use an older technique called EEG. So if we move on a slide, this is the little dots there are where you have the electrodes placed on the head, and then we click on again. We then measure the direct electrical activity of the brain. And it used to be, this has been going around since the 1930s, and you can see how wiggly a line is. And so this is an example of an EEG. And it's a little bit hard to see because it's quite chaotic. There are lots of different lines. We're measuring different parts of the brain. The first half of this slide is somebody with their eyes open, and then they close their eyes halfway through, and you can see there's a degree of it's slightly easier to see. There's more synchronized activity, and this is a well-known phenomena that as you close your eyes, the brain becomes slightly more synchronized. And we were interested to see whether we could measure the direct electrical activity using EEG and measure it in the eyes open and the eyes closed state. So engineers in the University of Sheffield created a piece of software called the Error Reduction Ratio Causality Test. And essentially, we measured the amount of synchronization between the right and the left-hand side of the brain in the eyes open stage, and then we did it in the eyes closed stage. And what this graph shows you is that healthy controls in Alzheimer's disease in the eyes closed state, they have the same level of synchronization between the right and left of the brain. But when you open your eyes, healthy controls would desynchronize their brain in this sort of more chaotic, high entropy state. And that's really healthy because the brain wants to jump between different networks. But the people with Alzheimer's disease, they stayed in the similar state with their eyes open as well as eyes closed. So they couldn't desynchronize their brain. And we think it's connected a bit to the breakdown of the default mode network. There's less connectivity going on in the brain. There's less ability of the brain to jump between different networks. And this may relate to some of Simon's work because he's measuring with lots of colleagues in the university, experts in mitochondria, experts in creating these astrocytes. Can we measure the energy potential of people with Alzheimer's disease? And this has something to do with the energy supply of these mitochondria that may affect this ability to jump between different networks. The brain takes up an enormous amount of energy to work because it's got such a high, complex and difficult task to do.
Thank you, Dan.
Cool.
This is just another slide that, so as I was saying, that the original slide I showed you with the squiggly lines is what people used to look at, so paper recordings of these things. The ability to produce these new data relies on high engineers with these pieces of brilliant software that do high-level mathematics. So that we're measuring 2,000 data points per second from each electrode, and we can create these different images from it now, and we can look at how different areas of the brain are affected at different stages. And I quite like the picture because of this idea. I think the idea of it hanging down in space, but also in sleep, we know the brain with rhythms change as well. And there is some evidence out there that if you did prolonged EEG recordings of people during their sleep, you might see early changes as well. So this opens the possibility that we can do some of these tests remotely. You don't have to come into hospital. You can do some of the electrodes at home. We need to improve some of that. But it's a really exciting field to work in at the moment.
Oh. All right, yeah.
So I think this is one of the latest paintings that
Yes.
Kate created. Do you want to tell us a little
Yeah,
bit
so
about
this is painting number 5. This is the largest painting. I mean, they're all about 2 meters high, but this one is almost 2 meters wide. And with this piece, I suppose it was the end of the collection in a sense. I wanted to describe the aging brain, or the brain that's sort of almost things are not working so well and patterns are becoming more and more abstract. So with this, you can, I mean, obviously I'm hoping you can see it, but with this piece, it's become more abstract. So the central area where you normally see the sort of MRI shape of the brain is disappearing. After the middle part's got these like sort of very simple cell-like structures in, with the idea that everything has changed and patterns are just not happening the same, and it's become much more like, I suppose, an abstract painting in its purest form, I suppose. Still, positive, really nice colours, and still there are still things happening, but I suppose it was my interpretation of the ageing brain. I suppose you could also say that's got some links to Alzheimer's in the sense that once patterns and structure does break down, then I suppose the signals in the brain, the connections in the brain are sort of all over. There's no sort of structure to them. So yeah, so it's important the size of this one, so that when you see it, the size of the brain is much smaller, because I know that in the aging brain, the brain does shrink. So I wanted to make that feel like the painting was much bigger and the sort of focal point was much smaller. So yeah, that was that one.
I like how first you had this like a kind of like structured painting where you kind of demarcate the different elements in the first painting, equilibrium.
Yeah.
And then here, the colours are kind of merging together, just like you spoke about disconnections, like Dan's research. From the fMRI image, we see that there is a disconnection between different parts of the brain in Alzheimer's disease, and this happens naturally with aging, but more so in Alzheimer's disease, and I think that really comes through in that one. What do you guys think, Simon and Dan?
I really like about this is because quite often with research, this is our starting point to understand a disease at sort of the end of the process. And I think when you look at this painting and the first painting that Kate's created, it gets across the complexity of these diseases and studying them, and how when you're understanding what the relationship of how all these bits and pieces fit together fits with the original painting. But I also think it gives you hope as well, because you can see how this painting is created from elements of the first painting and the other painting. So you can see how when you're starting to study disease, there's a pathway to find your way through to the original state and then understand the pathology or the process that gets you there. So I really like this one.
And I think even though they are abstract, there are patterns in all of the paintings that repeat.
Oh yes.
And so that I don't sort of, when I'm painting and drawing on them and collaging, I'm looking for shapes. I'm looking to sort of carry out, like there's like an orange shape with almost with like a big eye which in my mind is like a cell. So it's an abstract form, but I do repeat certain shapes throughout the whole painting. But like Simon says, this one has become much more simplified, I suppose. The shapes are bigger, aren't they? And they're sort of not as connected. With the others, I think there's a much more of a connection going on. So yeah.
Did you have anything to add?
I was going to say that the original description of Alzheimer's disease was by Alois Alzheimer, a German pathologist over 100 years ago, and his first patient was a young woman in an asylum in Frankfurt, and the diagnosis depended on that post-mortem, so that she died, and he looked at the brain and he saw these two abnormalities, one inside the cell, these tangles that were damaging the neurons, he thought, and outside these sort of broken up proteins, which is now known as amyloid and tau. And for maybe 60 or 70 years, you could only make a definitive diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease at post-mortem. Someone had to die and to look at the brain under the microscope. And I think that part of the hope now is that we have these techniques. So, we can do EEG, we can do MRI, we can do functional MRI. With Simon's research, we can take skin samples from people at a stage and grow brain cells, and we can look at that brain cells in a dish and explore them at a really early stage. So therefore we can hopefully make a diagnosis earlier and test whether treatments work earlier as well. So I think there is a lot of hope.
Yeah, I think one of the messages that we wanted to get across is that you start early. Like increasing awareness about Alzheimer's disease is the only way that we can kind of try and reach people who do not show symptoms in its earliest stages and try to get treatment to them as soon as possible. Is there anything else that we wanted to say before we close off?
No.
Only it's been a joy working with you, Kate. I think it's really interesting to see how the paintings have advanced, and I think the scale of them is really impressive when you see them, and it's a shame we're not standing next to the artwork now and talking, and more people were here to sort of look at them and talk to us about it.
Of course,
but it's been a real pleasure.
No, it has been a really interesting process for me, because obviously working with 3 different researchers, it's been a challenge, but also really interesting. And I feel like there's a lot more, I'm inspired to do more, obviously. I don't want to sort of, even though Festival of the Mind is happening now, but I feel like there's potential to do more things in the future.
I think I've also grown through the process that we've been through. I've learned a lot about my research and how to kind of communicate it to someone who's not within the field.
Yes, of course.
It's always so difficult when you kind of are so narrowly focused in a particular aspect of research. You kind of lose sight of what other people know. You just say scientific words and just expect people to know. So it's been quite helpful, your paintings, to kind of express that.
Yeah, it has been very interesting, because obviously we didn't know at first, none of us, we hadn't planned that I was going to make the paintings. We had conversations, and then the work has grown obviously, it's, you know, I'm a mixed media, you know, I make paintings, but the work has grown out of the conversations. So that's been quite interesting, rather than we didn't have a definite, we're going to do X, Y and Z. I think that's quite important to keep the, I suppose, to capture the essence of the research and to keep it fresh and to keep it poignant, I suppose. So, yeah.
We've had a few questions
Okay.
whilst we've been talking. So the first one: have patients or the people who were scanned seen the artworks yet? If so, what were their responses to the pieces? So I think probably because the artworks have only sort of hot off the press, they've not really been shown to the people who've been involved in it yet.
No, but we are quite interested, aren't we, to see what people's response is.
Yeah.
So yeah,
and there's maybe something going on in the new year where we display this to people with.
We do have a group, there are 2 groups in Sheffield of patients with Alzheimer's and other dementias who meet, that we as researchers take our research ideas to them to get their input onto saying, is this a good research idea, what do you think? They help us write proposals, they help us write the information leaflet that we're going to give to patients. And so I think that's 2 really good groups that we could show the artwork to.
Yes.
This one might be more focused at Mo's research. As obesity's increased in recent years, has the incidence of Alzheimer's increased too? That's what someone's asked.
Yes, that is actually the same sentence that I write every time I write an abstract for my obesity research, but it's very true. There has been a steady rise in the prevalence of cardiovascular risk factors like type 2 diabetes and obesity. And the thing is, like, all of these conditions are kind of intermingled. It's very difficult to tease apart obesity from diabetes, from high blood pressure, and they kind of tend to coexist. So leading a healthier lifestyle, again, is what I would advocate. And yes, to answer your question, there has been an increasing rise in people with Alzheimer's disease with a rise in these risk factors. And considering the current situation with COVID and with people not being able to go out or go to the gyms, it's probably going to increase even further, and we need to be aware about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a complex relationship, isn't there, that definitely both these factors have increased over the last sort of 20 to 30 years. And so the final question: the researchers all seem to love the artworks. Me too. That's the question. But I wondered if working with Kate has brought any new perspectives to their research. So maybe we go around. Dan, do you want to?
Yeah. So this is my 3rd time working in Festival of the Mind, and so I've worked with a series of dancers, and I worked with some people who made a short play, a story around Alzheimer's disease. And I think each time I've done it, I've learned something about discussing the real complex idea that how the brain is interconnected. How can we get that message across to people and make it in a comprehensible way? And I think the last time it was just me, so this has been really interesting working with Simon and Mo, of trying to make a series of paintings and make a stories, because I think Sheffield does lots of research on dementia. There are lots and lots of people working, and so this morning there was a meeting about trying to get some of that together, and I think we need to make the public aware of how much research we do in Sheffield and get their input to help us. So I think it's always a learning process.
How about you, Mo?
Well, like I said before, it was very helpful in terms of kind of expressing my research in a different light, and it made me look at my research in a different light. Like the whole colours about, you know, the blue and the pink and sweets and candy. That is more relatable to people, isn't it? It's not when I show brain images or some graphs, people can't really make much of it. Or
No. I think sometimes artwork, particularly abstract, people can have their own, almost they feel a bit safer with it because you can have your own interpretation, so you can sort of get into it and then think, oh, I like that because I like the colours, and then once you're engaged in something, you might then go, oh, I see what that's about, and it's almost like it's an easier win, because it's engaging people, which is the hardest when you're trying to sort of get something across.
I think the idea of the abstract nature is really interesting. When I did the work with the dance, that was abstract dance too, but when people with Alzheimer's came and watched that, and carers, and they were really moved by it, and I think people will be moved by these pictures because it gives people a sort of sense of space. It's not entirely it isn't just for the researcher to, as you say, to say all the science and this is the statistically relevant thing. It's giving somebody space to explore some of the research and some of the ideas, and that abstract nature is something that obviously I've got no skills in or no knowledge about really. So it's very interesting seeing how people respond to that. And I think it's back to the first question, or the question, how will our patients, the people with Alzheimer's, respond to this? And I think there's lots of positive responses we will get from them.
Yes.
For me, it's about the communication between, like, I think I've learned a lot about, because this whole project, I think, for us was to how we communicate science, you know, to everybody. And I think, like, the interaction that we've had talking about these different projects has been really enlightening just to see how different, you know, someone's interpretation can be. And I think that's a really important thing to understand as a scientist, because and even as a doctor as well, because when you're explaining things to people, you know, what you understand might be, it's very different. It's a very different painting that, pardon the pun, to what people may come up with their own.
Yeah, I agree. It's how you perceive something. I mean, I'd like to say that you guys have been very amazingly flexible and amazingly supportive of, because in a way you could have gone, I don't, abstract paint, what's all that about? But you've sort of just embraced it and gone with it, thankfully. So thank you.
Great.
It was a real pleasure working with you, and those paintings are fantastic.
Marvellous. Good. That's what we want. Happy researchers.
So these are the 5 paintings for you to take in all together. They're just so many colours. I love it.
I suppose there are some colours that go through, aren't there? There is like a palette.
Yeah.
But they do change. Yeah. Yeah, we wanted them to be hopeful as well as inspiring, didn't we, in a way.
Okay.
Right.
I'd like to thank everybody. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Dan, for being with us today. I'd like to thank Festival of the Mind for having us up here. And thank you for tuning in today. Thank you for your patience in listening to us. And there will be more available on the website. And that's it. Thank you.